lecture, we continue our lecture series on medieval Europe. And in this lecture, we are going to be looking at the Anglo-Saxons. Now, the Anglo-Saxons, who are going to be primarily residing on the island of Britain, really need to be addressed in two separate lectures. The reason for this is because Anglo-Saxon England is really divided into two parts. Part 1 is before the Vikings arrive in the mid-8th century, and Part 2 is after they arrive. And the reason for this is because the island of Britain under the Anglo-Saxons is fundamentally altered by the Vikings. So what we're going to do in this lecture is start by looking at the Anglo-Saxons, their arrival to Britain up to the arrival of the Vikings. In the next lecture, we're going to look at the Vikings generally, how they come from the north, conquer Britain, parts of Britain, conquer parts of Ireland, and start to invade the continent. And then in the lecture after that, we are going to return to Anglo-Saxon England and see how it is different and how it becomes unified under a king known as Alfred the Great. The Anglo-Saxons were the combined groups of the Angles, the Saxons, and a few smaller groups, such as the Jutes, J-U-T-E-S, Jutes. All of these groups were Germanic tribes who hailed from the northern parts of Europe, specifically modern-day Belgium, Netherlands, and northern Germany. How did these tribes migrate from northern Europe to England? This question shall frame our discussion here. If you are an American listener, you probably view the terms Britain, United Kingdom, England, British Isles, etc. as either synonymous or nearly synonymous. These are, however, very different terms. The British Isles collectively refer to the many islands including including Ireland and Britain. Britain is the island on which the modern-day countries of Scotland, Wales, and England reside. Ireland is the island adjacent to Britain's west coast. On the island of Ireland rest two modern-day countries, the Republic of Ireland, often referred to simply as Ireland, and Northern Ireland. The United Kingdom is a very modern construction that encapsulates England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. So, when I use the term Britain throughout all of these lectures, I am referring strictly to the island of Britain. When I refer to Ireland, I am referring strictly to the island of Ireland as a whole. When I refer to the British Isles, I am referring to the entire collection of islands, including Britain and Ireland and all the surrounding places as well. Now that we've discussed a bit of the technicality and gotten that out of the way, let's turn our attention to Britain. Britain is the island on which we will spend most of our time in this lecture. Although we often think of Britain as a singular entity, it is today a very diverse place, with many different languages, peoples, dialects, and cultures. This is a modern-day picture. In the ancient and medieval times, the island of Britain was even more divided. I want to spend a few minutes and discuss these divisions on the island and why these divisions existed and continue to exist today. First, and probably the most obvious thing I want to mention, is that Britain is an island. I know that this is obvious, but its obviousness means that we don't truly appreciate it. Why is it significant that the region of Britain is an island? Well, there's a lot of salient aspects of this. First, islands are very vulnerable militarily. What do I mean? Well, say I want to invade Britain. I have many places to choose from. Do I want to invade the west coast, the east coast, the south? Do I want to try and control a neighboring island such as the Isle of Wight to the south and stage an invasion to establish a beachhead? In modern times, military units can relatively quickly be moved to defend the island, but in ancient and medieval times, people did not have access to modern engines of war. Nor do they have access to the numbers of units to defend the island. Defending all of these borders is therefore rather difficult. Further, how do you know when a unit, which will invade by sea, will be coming? Scouts on land are far easier to place than scouts on sea. They are much more easily concealed. For this reason, Britain's history is one of a series of invasions. And these lectures, we're going to see these invasions play out. First with the Romans, then the Anglo-Saxons, then the Vikings, then the Normans, then the Plantagenets. We're going to see all these people play out and invade Britain. A second reason why Britain, being an island, is significant is quick access to ports. Ports provide many different benefits. Most importantly, for economic reasons, is the ability to trade. Britain will thrive throughout the medieval and early modern period as a major center of trade. This allowed Britain to establish itself as one of the largest empires the world has ever seen. These ports provide another benefit as staging locations for military invasions. During the Middle Ages, France will regularly have to keep an eye on England, as its proximity to its eastern border put it at constant risks of invasion. Whoever controlled Britain, therefore, had the ability to place constant military pressure on the western coastal regions of Western Europe. Let's turn our attention now and look at the island of Britain's internal geography. If you ever have a chance, examine a topographical map of Britain. What stands out to you? You should notice that the southeastern regions of the island are relatively level compared to the mountainous regions in the north and west. Why do I mention this? Well, let me answer that question with another question. What do mountains do? Do they make travel easy or difficult? The obvious answer is that they make travel difficult. Because they make travel difficult, they make invasions difficult. Because invasions are difficult, it means that local forces are able to stage strong defenses relatively easily. Because local forces are able to defend easily, they are able to resist hegemony of a foreign power. Now, where do these mountains reside? If you said Wales in the west, Cornwall in the southwest, and Scotland in the north, you'd be spot on. There is a reason why, even today, Wales and Scotland retain a bit of autonomy. They were able to resist English attempts at control for centuries. This resistance began in the ancient and medieval periods. Why were they able to resist? Because they were able to easily defend their borders because they were surrounded by mountainous terrain. Because mountains create natural boundaries that allow for isolation, they also do a secondary thing. They retain cultural and linguistic autonomy for the peoples who reside among them. Most, if not all, Scottish and Welsh citizens speak English today. Some also speak Welsh and Scots Gaelic. I cannot emphasize enough how important and significant this is. Language, far more than skin color, far more than that pigment in your skin, is one of the greatest, if not the greatest, delineator of people. The Anglo-Saxons themselves believe this. In Old English, the word for people is theoden, and one word for language is yetheoda. In other words, language defines people. The two are connected. Why do I emphasize this? Well, if language defines people, it allows people with a distinct language to remain different and somewhat autonomous. In other words, even if the Anglo-Saxons conquered Wales, the Welsh would continue to speak Welsh and retain some level of autonomy. Now let's start turning to the history of the island of Britain. Before the arrival of the Romans in the 1st century BCE, there were 4 rough peoples on the island. In the north, there were the Picts and the Scots. In the southwest were the Cornish. In the west were the Welsh. And on the rest of the island were various types of Celtic tribes, collectively referred to as the Britons. It is beyond the scope of this lecture to discuss the movements of these peoples to the island, and this gets into more archaeology than history anyway. Suffice it to say, the island was multicultural and multilingual, but primarily dominated by Celts, if not entirely so. During the final decades of the Roman Republic under Julius Caesar and other commanders, the Romans made strong pushes across Gaul, modern-day France, and into Britain. In Britain, the Romans were faced with several Celtic peoples. the Picts in the north, the Welsh in the west, and the Britons and everyone else in the south. During the 1st century CE, the Roman Empire managed to secure the southern parts of the island and began pushing northward, isolating the Picts roughly to modern day Scotland. Along the northern border, Emperor Hadrian eventually built his famous wall, which still bears his name today, and you can still visit it today. Now, moving ahead to the 3rd century, if you've heard my lectures on Rome, the name crisis of the 3rd century should stand out to you. As the crisis of the 3rd century took its toll on the Roman institutions, the empire was forced to pull its resources away from the fringes of its borders and instead direct them at internal threats. After the crisis was brought to an end by Diocletian, the Roman economy rebounded. In the 5th century, problems reemerged in the West. Barbarians continued to attack the Roman frontiers on the continent. This forced Rome to again allocate resources to the heartland, primarily Gaul. In doing this, Rome left Britain exposed. In the late 4th century, barbarians consisting of Saxons, Angles, Jutes, and Frisians began to attack the island. The local population, the Britons, continued to fight back against these invasions. The Roman Emperor Constantine III, who was elected in 407, failed to aid the island, and by 410, Rome had largely abandoned the Britons and Britain. This is the environment and the setting for the King Arthur legends. During the 5th century, the Anglo-Saxons gained a strong foothold in Britain, and during the 6th century, they pushed further into the island. By 600, the Anglo-Saxon barbarians had largely secured their rule. They controlled central and southern Britain. This region was divided essentially into 4 major kingdoms: East Anglia, Mercia, Northumbria, and Wessex, and 3 minor kingdoms: Essex, Kent, and Sussex. To the west and north, the Anglo-Saxons still faced Celtic peoples. Each of the major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms would increase in power and fall over the next few centuries. During the 7th century, these kingdoms would also battle against one another and have shifting alliances. By the 8th century, the Anglo-Saxons were faced with invaders, the Vikings. Turning away now from the political history of Anglo-Saxon England, let's make a final note about Anglo-Saxon culture. Now, the chief epic of the Anglo-Saxons is a work you've probably heard of. It's Beowulf, which is actually based in the homeland of Northern Europe. In this work, we have a rare glimpse at life in Anglo-Saxon kings' courts. An Anglo-Saxon king was a war chief who provided housing, food, and loot for his retinue of soldiers. The king would have had a large hall, known as a mead hall, in which his courtiers would have feasted and slept. In return for loyalty, the king was expected to pay for his retinue by raiding neighbors and producing and procuring loot. In other words, the basis for Anglo-Saxon culture was a necessary belligerence. One final note should be made about the language of the Anglo-Saxons. For those listening to this, their language should have special significance. Modern English has its roots in the language of the Anglo-Saxons, who spoke what we call today Old English. Although they spoke in an early form of English, it is nearly unintelligible to a modern English-speaking person. So, for example, were I to read off the first poem ever recorded in English, it sounds nothing like English, right? So, nu shulan herion heilvon riches weard meato des mechti on des modja thank. Those are the first couple lines of the first English poem ever written and recorded, and yet it's unintelligible to a modern English-speaking person's ear. This is where I really want to end this lecture. What I want you to remember and what I want you to really take away from this is that the Anglo-Saxons who arrived on Britain conquered the local Celtic populations and established for themselves a large group of roughly 7 or 8 kingdoms. These kingdoms constantly vied for power on the island. In other words, the island of Britain in the mid 8th century was a very, very divided place with multiple kings and multiple kingdoms. When the Vikings come, who we're going to meet in the next lecture, all of this is going to change.